Good evening, everyone. Today we are pleased to present our second ever CAB Climate Action Brookline webinar broadcast by the Brookline Interactive Group. We are experiencing a few technical difficulties, so we appreciate your patience. Today we are running this webinar on the Zoom platform, but we are also running live on Brookline Interactive Group's Channel 3, as well as their live streams on their website. You can get there by going to brooklineinteractive.org/live. Today's webinar is called The Undeclared Emergency Addressing Climate Change in Our Schools. I'm going to give you a little background while we wait for more people to log on. Again, if you are on the Zoom platform, we have a panel of speakers that are going to be talking. We have the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll talk about that and how you can do that in a moment. First, I want to give a little background on Climate Action Brookline. If you're interested in getting involved, one component of what we do is around schools, but we do a lot of other things. We have monthly meetings on the second Mondays of the month from 6 to 7:30. Those have sort of moved online in this new unique situation we're all in under the coronavirus crisis. But we have some great things that have been going on. This spring, we transferred some of our Brookline Climate Spring events into this online format, which included a really great select board candidates forum that happened on Monday. And you can see that on VIG if you missed it and you want to see what the select board candidates' views are on climate and other environmental issues. We have launched a climate crisis engagement fund, which offers residents of Brookline a way to kind of access small bits of funding that might get them doing some interesting grassroots projects. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. And we do a lot of other outreach. And one of the big things we're trying to encourage is to get all Brookline residents to consider opting up in their electricity bills to 100% renewable energy. Just an overview of what the Brookline Green Teams is. It started as a Climate Action Brookline initiative maybe a decade ago, trying to get into the schools and think about promoting environmental stewardship and education in the schools. And myself and Rebecca Salguero, as well as many others in the Climate Action Brookline, as well as Mothers Out Front and other groups in town, have been participating in this, whether or not they call it the Green Teams. But that includes working to make their schools more environmentally friendly, working on school gardens, getting composting programs started at the high school, at Pierce, at Lincoln, and more, and taking initiatives through the Safe Routes to School program, improving walking and biking safety to encourage more of that and less car transportation. But this has been an initiative that's been going on, and it's bubbling up from each of the schools, and we've been trying to kind of coordinate and share resources and ideas. So if you're interested in being more involved, you can email the email on the page right now, which is greenteam.pierce@gmail.com, or you can reach out to CAB, Climate Action Brookline, at any time. One of the things we did this year is we did a survey of teachers, educators, interested parties, students, parents, and we got about 100 respondents this past fall. And this just gives you a brief indication of where people that were surveyed were interested across classroom curriculum, education, outdoor education, cafeteria practices, school-wide practices. So this is kind of informing a lot of our discussion. Roger Grande, who's our speaker today, was one of the leads working with me and a few others, Jeremy Block, Ben, Rebecca Salguero, and a few others. And we had a few great meetings this winter. Rebecca has put together a website. It's a work in progress, but we encourage you to visit it, talking about what we've been doing and what we're hoping to continue doing next year, and as we have time. Things have changed given the current circumstances, but we still think it's a crisis that we need to address. So one example of some of the things going on, we have today the founder of the Keep Club at Driscoll, and she can tell you more about it, but there's some really great initiatives that have been going on for years, and we want to elevate those and find ways for all of our kids and school communities to participate. I mentioned opt up. If you're not familiar, brooklineoptup.com or brooklinegreen.com will get you to a page where you can sign up. And since we have a lot of time at home online, I hope you'll take a minute and check if you are signed up already, or if not, it just takes a moment with your electricity bill. So one last slide before we get started. There are 3 ways to ask questions. If you are on the platform right now, you can put a question in the Zoom platform. You can put a question in the Q&A box. If you have somehow signed in as a panelist, we apologize for that technical difficulty. Please make sure your camera and your voice is off. We're not taking live questions at the moment, but you can chat it if you can't get into the Q&A box. If you are not live on the Zoom webinar platform, you can be on YouTube Live or the Facebook stream for BIG, brooklineinteractive.org/live. We'll get you the links to get you there, and you can post a question in the chat box or in the comments. And finally, if you're not on and you wanted to ask a question, you can get onto one of those YouTube Live or Facebook Live streams to ask a question. So with that, I want to turn it over to the main program today. So what we're going to have today is a presentation by the Brookline High School Innovation Fund Fellow and Brookline High School teacher, Roger Grande. He has been working on this for quite some time. This whole year he's had some time dedicated towards this issue. So he'll give us a presentation about half an hour, and then we'll follow that by a roundtable discussion with a wonderful group of panelists that kind of gives us a flavor of what people are thinking across the district. Jeremy Block is at the Florida Ruffin Ridley School, or CCS. Suzanne Federspiel is a Brookline School Committee member and also up for re-election this year. Aspen Johnson is a Pierce School 6th grade student. Anjali Mitra is a BHS student. Tanya Paris is a Pierce kindergarten teacher. Gary Schiffman is the Brookline High School Social Studies Curriculum Coordinator, and Francesca Stark is the Driscoll teacher and the faculty advisor of the Keep Club. So we'll have a conversation with them afterwards. Again, if you have questions that come up, feel free to post them in advance. Otherwise, we look forward to an interesting discussion. After the half-hour discussion, we'll open it up to questions for the last half hour or so. So thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Roger.
Good evening, all. In a few minutes, I'm going to also do some slide sharing, and there may be an awkward moment or two, so hopefully we can get through that transition quickly. I want to recognize that we've all chosen to talk about an upsetting issue, climate change, in the midst of an already difficult time. This is hard. A lot of the joy I feel as a teacher has been stripped away. I can't see my students. They don't all join my Zoom sessions. Those who do, I can't respond to their facial expressions. I miss our up-close collective endeavor interwoven with humor, tears, excitement, discovery, and expression. The COVID-19 pandemic has transformed our lives and our schools, which have suddenly become more confusing and complicated, and without as clear a direction as they did just months ago. The pandemic will end, but climate change will continue to transform our lives and our schools. These crises are not analogous, but they do overlap. Both provide an opportunity to assess the calamity of ignoring expertise in preparation for what was and is a certainty. Many people experience and understand both crises as a massive uncertainty, leading some to respond viscerally from a place of fear and emotion rather than based on fact and science. People hoard toilet paper and cling to fiction at a time when fact is a matter of survival. Reasonable people ignore modest recommendations for social distancing. Both crises reveal deep fissures in our social fabric. The lack of a strong safety net that includes medical security, housing security, food security, ability to fully access education, physical safety at home, and lack of personal savings define these crises and force some to make impossible decisions. These disparities intensify hardship for our most vulnerable and worsen these crises for all of us in dire times, though they are felt much more deeply in marginalized communities and groups. Both are public health crises. The pandemic sent us home to reduce transmission. It'll be harder to identify the role that climate change plays among our students with asthma or anxiety. COVID-19 is novel. There's a lot of uncertainty. We have less than half a year of data on this virus. Climate change, however, is well understood and has been for a long time. We have decades of data from tropical and deciduous forests, glaciers, diverse soil samples and ice cores, and from the upper atmosphere. Our understanding draws from dozens of scientific fields, from economics, politics, sociology, and the arts. We have observations about how communities respond, mitigate, and adapt. We have years of tech innovation to draw on. Now, it's obvious why we can't delay responding to COVID-19. It's less obvious why we continue to ignore the climate crisis in our curriculum and school culture. Unlike coronavirus, climate change is an undeclared emergency, yet we know a lot more about climate change. Both of these crises provide an opportunity, just as the recession did 10 years ago, just as previous pandemics did. And that is why we decided to proceed with this program tonight. So I want to thank you for participating. I'll call attention to some upsetting things tonight, but ultimately tonight is about empowering ourselves and taking control. It's a vision for creating something great together and moving forward. Many experience climate change as a tsunami of uncertainty, rendering us immobile. But together, as a community and school district, we can reframe uncertainty as risk and instead strategize, make informed decisions, mitigate and educate, and experience accomplishment, which is so much better than denial or bewilderment. When we reframe climate change as risk rather than uncertainty, we can begin to move forward with greater clarity. We can marshal our strength to act based on facts rather than feel too overwhelmed to act at all. Tonight, I want to add my voice to what some of my colleagues and many from our parent and student community have been demanding for a long time. Let's make climate sustainability an essential core value and practice in Brookline Public Schools, not just in the classroom, but in our school culture, our norms, and in several other ways, which I'll highlight towards the end. I want to acknowledge the many teachers across our district who have worked tirelessly without district support to prepare their students for living through climate change. Thank you. I'm indebted. I want to thank the amazing efforts of some from our parent community who embody leadership and resistance and persistence. Thank you. I want to thank tonight's participants for clearing a path forward. I offer my warmest and most heartfelt gratitude to our student leaders at BHS, many of whom I've been able to work with this year. You are so outstanding. And I want to express my deep appreciation to Christy Electris, to Rebecca Salguero Palacios, Jeremy Block, and Ben Kelly, who've made tonight and much more happen. I can't wait to meet with you again at Cafe Nero, drink coffee, and continue to plot our small revolution. Still, some might ask, why talk about climate change now in the midst of a more pressing crisis? We acknowledge that our school leaders have giant challenges to resolve and new opportunities to innovate. Our current circumstance is a colossal teachable moment. Our students and educators deserve that we make meaning out of our collective trauma, and that schools of all institutions do not squander the outpouring of solidarity, of compassion and insight that elevates our purpose now. Education is about diminishing uncertainty, clarifying probability, and better understanding patterns, behaviors, and skills that lead to more predictable outcomes, whether it's studying for a test, mastering a formula, or making predictions based on evidence. Schools bring people together to engage in evidence-based inquiry, address authentic intellectual challenges, build foundational skills so that young people can thrive later in life. They're about exciting passion and cultivating compassion for others who must contend with challenging circumstances. Schools are about equity and reducing opportunity gaps. Schools are about fostering an ethos of inclusivity and promoting healthy norms so that all members of a school community can participate and are motivated to buy in. Now, that sounds like a perfect storm for addressing climate change. Skills and focus on the future, preparing young people for the real world, emphasis on collective security. So why are so many schools lagging in preparing young people for the world they will inhabit in 10, 20, and 30 years, which will be radically different and likely much more fragile? More specifically, why are our Brookline schools, which are so highly regarded, largely ignoring humanity's greatest challenge? We understand that we must commit to being more responsive to race and racism, to gender and sexual identity, to poverty. When we were sent home from school to quarantine, we immediately understood that we first needed to meet the needs of our students who depend on schools for food security and digital connection. At Brookline High School, where I teach, we work hard to identify individual risks that our students face so we can help them navigate how to thrive in school. Our schools need to identify collective risks that our young people face as they become more independent and have to survive on their own. A good school like Brookline High School asks all members of the community to take responsibility for creating a culture that ensures safety and equity for all. Some of our students require more support and attention than others. We give it because we recognize that equity, not simply equality, enhances all of our experiences. This is the idea of social solidarity. It's what social distancing is in part premised on, that each of our individual actions are intertwined with others, and that all of us shall behave in a manner that enhances the health of the community as a whole. We act in a way that protects our interdependence. It's good for you individually and for all of us collectively. If you work in a school, that should be second nature. It's why schools are the perfect place to address the climate crisis, where we demand exceptional behavior by individuals so we may enhance our collective experience. It's embedded in nearly all we do. It's probably impossible to calculate the social benefits of any individual student or teacher's actions, but we do it. So if we who work in schools understand this, and we do, then why is Brookline High School and other Brookline public schools entirely unremarkable when it comes to preparing our young people for climate change? Why haven't I ever received a message, at least that I can recall, from a school leader, a superintendent, or a school committee member that identifies learning about climate change as an essential endeavor? How hard does the climate crisis have to bear down on us before we act? Must we experience wildfires ravaging our homes and schools? Must we have to salvage what is left of our belongings after a destructive hurricane? How personal does it have to become? Why hasn't our school system recognized that the actions we take now are essential to reducing our exposure to catastrophe soon? Yes, soon. So rather than put aside climate change while we struggle to endure the pandemic, let's learn from our current circumstance. I'm going to now try to share my slides. We'll see how that goes. Give me just a moment. And I think it is working. Okay. Give me just a moment. All right. Long pause. So one of the perennial tasks that we ask students to perform is to explore identity. Students reflect on race and gender and their emotional, social, and intellectual selves throughout their schooling. As climate change and climate anxiety, already measurable among our students, intensifies, it becomes increasingly important that students have the means to reflect personally on the dynamic forces of climate change that surround them. The more intimately we understand that relationship, the more we will care about saving what we may lose. And we all have a relationship with nature, the natural world, and the built world. We all have landscapes and foodscapes imprinted on our developing brains that shape what we desire and devalue. That landscape could be agricultural, it could be pristine forest, and it could be an urban built environment with barely any trace of the natural world. All are equally powerful, and all offer us something to draw on when we think about how our own life histories are intertwined with climate change, including the forces of race and disparity. I'd like to add our relationship to the natural world as a dimension of identity that we explore in the classroom. It may sound awkward, but we all have a climate story. This is mine, albeit a little bit abbreviated. I grew up one block from Lake Michigan in a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lake Michigan is the fourth largest lake in the world, 307 miles long at its longest stretch, and part of the ecosystem of 4 states. In my youth, I visited Wisconsin's marshes, fragments of what remained of upper Midwestern prairie, lakes, and northern woodlands, including those reforested areas in northern Wisconsin that looked like telephone pole farms, trees planted in precise rows to maximize the next timber harvest. These striking landscapes were originally formed by glaciers. During the last ice age, the Laurentine Glacier covered Wisconsin until warming began 18,000 years ago. At one time, it was home to the woolly mammoth and American mastodon. This is my one little bit of humor throughout the whole presentation. Those of you from Wisconsin will know what I'm talking about here. Thank you for that laugh. All right, one of the 5 lobes of ice that pushed over Wisconsin created Green Bay and descended as far south as Madison, the state capital, where I studied history. The glacier took 7,000 years to retreat, and as it did, it left debris and formed lakes and wetlands in eastern and northern Wisconsin at the glacier's outermost limit. Retreating glaciers left lakes with earthen dams that sometimes burst, and the lakes drained and silt settled into the basin. Peat accumulated, forming marshes, resulting in a rich habitat that was home to wildlife and people. Horicon Marsh remains as a stunning glacial fragment, and it's a major stopover for migratory birds. Pot-shaped depressions or kettles formed when large blocks of buried ice melted. Some are preserved in the Kettle Moraine State Forest. Some are just within reach of Brookline High School. The water that rushed from those burst dams, carved rivers into rock, and you can see that in the image. The receding glaciers also left deposits of sand. Now, 10 Wisconsin counties are referred to as sand counties, the eponym for the great Wisconsin naturalist Aldo Leopold's book, Sand County Almanac. These are the landscapes of my imagination, the natural spaces that nourish my soul and animate me as much as any. This is a landscape of cattails and tall grasses, of white birch and blue grain silos, pasture full of Jersey, Holstein, and Guernsey dairy cows, and waving fields of golden corn, punctuated by chunky Lutheran steeples. This is also the landscape that animated Senator Gaylord Nelson 50 years ago when he called for the first Earth Day. Nelson, who fought in Okinawa during World War II and later became governor, was driven by environmental stewardship and conservation and initiated a program to purchase private land and conserve it, especially wetlands and wildlife habitat threatened by development. He secured funding for cleanup of the Great Lakes, which had been trashed by upper Midwestern industry. And on April 22nd, 1970, as we know from just a month ago, 20 million people participated in a national teach-in, as Nelson called it, forever tying environmental stewardship to education. There's another landscape of my imagination. Excuse me. Milwaukee is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. The drive due west from the shores of Lake Michigan into Milwaukee reveals a steady decline of income and housing stock. As a white kid from a predominantly white suburb, I marveled at these streets, flanked by billboards advertising cheap malt liquor and cigarettes. The number of small corner bars offering no pretense was uncountable. Row after row of adjacent streets, perfectly parallel like those telephone pole farms up north, were crowded with wooden bungalow homes bearing the marks of immense neglect or worse, charred by fire. The 53206 zip code incarcerates 60% of its Black men, the highest rate of any zip code in the United States. Now, I never heard the word segregation growing up, but I observed it driving across town. I understand now that we all live on one side or the other of segregation. Both landscapes of my imagination were formed by seismic forces, the latter by the 20th century's great migration of African Americans fleeing Southern terror and in search of employment in the industrial economy of the North, and subsequently the largest example of social engineering in American history, redlining. Between the first Earth Day and our gathering tonight is a story that we all share, a model of economic development that requires a destruction of nature, the rise of neoliberalism that has exacerbated inequalities and weakened our democratic resolve, a system that relegates pain to poor and people of color communities here and abroad so that those who make political decisions can ignore the destruction from fossil fuel consumption. In Wisconsin, the sand counties are now mined for frac sand. We are only 6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit from the time glaciers deposited that sand. Imagine the geologic transformation that will result from continued pumping of that sand underground to fracture the earth in order to extract and combust natural gas that heats our homes and our buildings and our planet. A few more degrees and we are cooked. The aggressive mining of that sand is in great measure due to Wisconsin's transition from a progressive to a regressive government that erodes the conservation ethos of Alda Leopold and Gaylord Nelson, an ethos that is taught in a vacuum and only to our youngest grades. Along with that erosion is the atrophying of civic strength, which has weakened unions and healthcare, depressed wages, questioned science, magnified the racial wealth gap, and suppressed voting, especially among Milwaukee's large African American population, all in the name of protecting jobs like frac sand mining. As long as there are massive social vulnerabilities and disparities, a small group of people can design the destruction of the natural habitat and life on Earth as we know it. The less our students know of nature, and the less opportunity they have to explore its wonder and discover landscapes to shape their lives, the less they will know what they need to preserve and why. Schools are the natural place to cultivate this love and imagination. And the less students understand the urban landscapes that have been transformed by social and political decisions, the less they will understand inequity and its role in driving the climate crisis. Schools are where equity, inquiry, and cultivation of empathy for others all intermingle. Schools are where we ask students to tell their stories and discover their values. Schools are where we devote a society's concern for the welfare of young people and prepare them to thrive in the future. Schools are our only common experience for addressing racial equity, engaging in evidence-based inquiry, and learning to appreciate truth and democracy. Addressing these things without addressing climate change is a colossal exercise in dissonance. Making sustainability a core value and practice is essential if we are to support our young people secure their future, their prosperity, their health and well-being, their food security, their democracy, and their ability to live peacefully amongst each other. Climate change is the common denominator that threatens all of these things. The idea is not to reinvent our education, but rather to embed what we already do with a sustainability mindset in the classroom, in our school culture, and in our school systems. Teachers are busy and don't have sufficient support for professional development, and the burden of building sustainability initiative must be shared across our school system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these 6 areas: equity, impact, ways of knowing, natural environment, empowerment, systems, and interdependence as a proposal for how we can bridge climate change and what we already teach. Excuse me. However we design our models, we must be accountable to the following. What must our students know and what skills should they possess to prepare them for life after graduation? At BHS, let me go back actually one slide there. At BHS, I've been using the phrase graduate green. It means knowing much more than climate science. It requires a pronounced understanding of the dynamics of inequality. It demands a sensitivity to the erosion of democracy and gut reaction against threats to collective security. It means that students have examined crises from migration conflict and subjected their media and information diet to rigorous professional standards. It means that students deserve learning that crosses interdisciplinary boundaries with opportunities for authentic application. And it means that it is incumbent upon us as educators to provide students with opportunities to practice leadership. Well, this stuff is already in our professional DNA. We need to activate it for sustainability. Consider the world that our young people will inhabit. Excuse me. Race, class, and gender disparities are a primary driver of climate change and a core concern of schools. We can't adequately address racism without including climate change in the discussion. The inverse is also true. Ignoring that fact is an example of the dissonance I mentioned. Climate change magnifies racial inequality. Recall, after the levees broke in New Orleans, African Americans bore the brunt of suspicion, dislocation, and violence when that city fell into crisis. In the United States, we continue to live with the consequences of redlining, a federal policy buttressed by enthusiasm in hundreds of cities that used home loan schemes to effectively delimit by race who could live where. It was the massive wave of structural racism that undermined economic development of millions of African Americans. Areas colored in red on city maps by the Homeowners Loan Corporation were deemed to be poor investments based on the higher percentage of Black people that lived there. Whiter areas were deemed better investments, and neighbors signed restrictive covenants to limit home ownership to white people. It was more expensive and riskier to purchase a loan in a red area, and that was all that was available to African Americans. The imprint of these maps still color the contours of race and class in cities across the United States, and they concentrate climate vulnerability. They are more dense, they have less tree canopy, they are hotter and less air conditioned, they are urban heat islands. One research team measured heat gaps in American cities and compared them to redlining maps. They correlate closely. Climate change will exploit these vulnerabilities. Young and elderly people will suffer high rates of heat stroke and asthma. Hospitalizations will increase. Since 1982, extreme heat has caused more deaths in Wisconsin than all of their natural disasters combined. Let's face it, this is not really a natural disaster. Heat can inflame anxiety and anger too. The North Milwaukee suburbs are disproportionately Black and disenfranchised. Elijah Furquan, a spoken word artist from this part of town, writes, "If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant, and we have only just begun to fry." And we know what happens to segregation and racial inequity when it goes unchecked. This is what it looks like when it becomes intolerable. Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was shot and killed and left in the street for hours as a grieving crowd assembled. Climate change exploits racial and spatial disparities and makes segregation much more intolerable. In Miami, one of the cities most threatened by rising sea levels, developers are pricing out Haitians from the Little Haiti neighborhood, one of the largest Haitian immigrant neighborhoods in the country, because at one point it was cheaper land, but it sits on higher ground than expensive and trendy buildings with ocean views. Conflict is increasingly pitched in a city where seawater already floods streets. Old vulnerabilities advance the next wave of our American segregation story, climate gentrification. The legacy of vulnerability will exacerbate disparities. Africa generates only 2% of global emissions, yet has already begun to feel way more than its share of food system disruption and related social conflict. Geography will intensify all over the world. In low-lying and coastal cities across Asia, millions will have to leave their homes due to rising sea levels. When the class of 2020 turns 50, we largely missed the class of 2020. Will we set the class of 2021 on the proper trajectory to address the massive challenges they'll face? The threats connected to water, for example, are many. Mount Kenya has lost 2/3 of its ice cover, stressing farmers who rely on snowpack melt below. and has already led to conflict over diminishing resources as animal herders drive their animals into farmland. In the northwestern United States, climate change-induced forest fires reduces canopy protection for snowpack, and blackened forests absorb more heat, melting snowpack earlier and faster, reducing the stream water below during the dry season. The stresses on food production where water for irrigation is scarce, or where seawaters flood, and will necessitate millions to migrate. In fact, thousands of climate refugees from Central America already arrive by the thousands, some who have fled due to climate threats to their agriculture. They may arrive in our schools. The politics and social change that arrives in their wake will certainly impact our lives. The examples that I just mentioned remind us of the relationship between our behaviors and the natural world, and the conflict that can result. These mass movements of people will impact all of us, politically and personally. They already do. As a teacher, I'm mindful of the physical and emotional health of the students in my classroom, particularly in relation to outside events. Excuse me, got a little behind my slides there. It saddens me how many of my students already experience anxiety and depression, so that it interferes with their ability to regularly attend and perform in school. Climate change and its effects will exacerbate anxiety, and we need to recognize its health impacts. Ignoring it is not the solution. Empowering students with knowledge and authentic learning opportunities, I believe, is a proactive step we can take. It's just as appropriate to introduce climate change in a social studies class as it is to address environmental health and resiliency in a wellness class. Another one of the bridges that I talked about was ways of knowing and showing. Part of the complexity of addressing climate sustainability is that we can't match a specific behavior of one person, one car, or one school to the melting of a specific glacier or to a specific tropical storm. Our consumption of fossil fuels creates diffuse impacts spatially and temporally. Our current energy and food systems offer us plausible deniability about the harm we create. This is a major reason why it's been hard to make the case for sustainability and structural change. For us who work in schools, we are tasked with teaching young people how to critically analyze and validate information, which is essential work to the maintenance of a democracy. Our work embodies the idea that we can know things to be true. As science, the media, and other professions that depend on professional standards and peer review come under attack, we in schools have an obligation to teach information literacy, which we do. Climate change and vaccination are perhaps the areas most threatened by disinformation, and it poses risks to democracy. The story of democracy, which I teach, doesn't end. If we skip teaching about climate change, students won't understand the risk to democratic culture. The fossil fuel industry and their allies in government do not have a monopoly on denial. We may intellectually understand and agree with climate science, but our institutional unwillingness to address climate change is a form of passive denial. Denial that we are the problem and denial that we are the solution. Imagine our students 20 years from now when the crisis is worse. What will they say about their education? They'll know that we had sufficient information to act. They'll know what the effects of climate change will feel like. They may even recall a handful of teachers who made an effort to help them understand sustainability. But they'll wonder why the foremost institution in their lives didn't embody the values of sustainability and model for them how to live, learn, and think sustainably. Let's talk about empowerment as the last bridge. What institutions and their leaders say and do matters. If our cafeterias are transparent about serving healthy and nutritious meals that promote sustainability, it matters. If they see that the classrooms and bathrooms provide supplies that reduce their adverse impact on the natural environment, it matters. If they learn how to compost food consumed in school and why they should, it matters. If they can no longer purchase single-use plastics at school and are told why, it matters. In fact, it's an expression of care for students' well-being now and in the future. Creating a culture of sustainability with its own set of norms conveys to students that their behaviors strengthen our institution, that they are not simply being led, but are empowered to lead and to make a difference. When we don't address climate change, we deny students the opportunity to be powerful. We want our students to be comfortable, safe, make good decisions, and be happy now. But that should not come at the expense of helping them to be resilient later. As the crisis in climate migration intensifies, for example, will our students retreat to nationalism, xenophobia, and a less inclusive democracy? Or will they serve as leaders among their peers and coworkers and remind them of what they learned in school about collective security, interaction with the natural environment? One of my neighbors of this school year, one of the highlights of this school year was to observe students in the Food Justice and Environmental Action Clubs design 3 sustainability lessons on recycling, composting, and the food system. and then trained more than 40 students to teach those lessons in every junior advisory this past February. Some of these same students led a day of assemblies on food security and climate change just 2 days before school closed this year. With very little adult support, they pushed the Graduate Green message. Sorry, that's not where we are either. Okay. They pushed the Graduate Green message. They addressed the fact that our institutional practices generate emissions and that students can be part of the solution. They helped build a culture of sustainability. We need school leadership to get behind these students. We cannot neglect how to prepare them for a climate change future. As we say at Brookline High School, we create the culture we want and need. And that includes a sustainability culture and the dividends it generates, a common school purpose, greater emphasis on equity, authentic education or experiential learning by engaging with real-world challenges, adult accountability for the decisions we have made, and empowered students who can clearly see a purpose in what they are learning. The organizers of tonight's event and members of Brookline Schools, of the Brookline Schools Green Teams are launching a sustainability pledge that we want school committee members and school leadership to sign on to. All right, now we understand that the pandemic complicates this effort tremendously. We also know that this pandemic provides us an opportunity to think differently and to be creative with people we may not normally work with. Our pledge mirrors the blueprint for applying to receive a Department of Education Green Ribbon Schools designation. We should be on that list. So they are, in sum, reducing our adverse, the pledge that is to reduce our adverse environmental impacts in all school-related activity, including renovation, waste, procurement, and transportation. 2, providing substantive climate change and sustainability education in every grade, including exposure to the natural world and outdoor education, climate stewardship, school gardens, and food system education. This should prepare us to become a farm-to-school institution and support professional development that values interdisciplinary design. And thirdly, the pledge asks that we commit to improving the health and wellness of staff and students by committing to increase the sourcing of healthy, local, and sustainable food served in our cafeterias, adding climate resilience and environmental health to our wellness and safe routes to school agenda. A culture of sustainability means that all of our institutional practices are part of the curriculum and that we are transparent about our cafeterias, our cleaning, our use of paper with our students, and regard all of our spaces and systems as part of the curriculum. It means that we stop the sales of single-use plastics, especially water sales. Many of those bottles will end up as microplastics in our ocean and may even re-enter the food chain. My global leadership students this year asked staff and students to pledge to refrain from purchasing water for 10 days and instead divert the money they'd spend to our sister city project in Nicaragua to improve their water, which puts them at risk of disease. What message do we send to students about trust in science, in public health, and the best part of our government if we encourage them to dismiss our very high quality tap water right here in Massachusetts? We know that composting is not going to solve climate change, but it's an important practice in our schools, and it allows us to transmit values and coalesce around meaningful community norms. That is what is meant by a culture of sustainability. We have more power and opportunity and responsibility than anyone who has come before us. Decisions we make daily constrain and diminish opportunity for my daughter's generation to thrive. Schools are the essential institution to address climate change. They're where equity, inquiry, the cultivation of empathy for other lives, and collectivity all intermingle. Schools are where we ask students to tell their stories and discover their values. And schools are where we devote a society's concern for the welfare of young people and prepare them to thrive in the future. We need to offer students opportunities to practice leadership and other skills, to embolden civil society, diffuse conflict, and imagine collective security. We need to support teachers with professional development, to design curriculum that is interdisciplinary and mission-driven. We need our admin to define our work and to sanction it. From pre-K to graduation, we need a community commitment to empower students and staff to make sustainable choices and to cultivate core values that prepare us to thrive in a fragile future. Our work, our activity, our decisions, and our omissions, not our emissions, our omissions, makes a profound impact on the environment and future. Let's work together to make the difference that we know we need to. Thank you. Okay, let me get off the slides there. So, Christy, I'm not sure if you want to say something at this point or if we should just go right to the roundtable.
Sure. So again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I know I've heard that we have over 50 people on Facebook and YouTube, and we have a large number on the Zoom platform. If you are not a panelist, can you make sure your video camera is off? just so that people who are participating in the panel can make sure we have kind of like the gallery view for that, and you can turn off non-video participants. With that, I think, Roger, would you like to launch into the discussion, or would you like me to give any other framing?
No, I think it's okay if we go right to discussion.
And oh, sorry, one last thing. If you do have questions for the panel that come up, well, again, will be about 30 minutes of discussion. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat. If you are signed in as a panelist inadvertently, go ahead and put it into the chat to the panelists, and we will do our best to kind of capture all of those. If you're on Facebook or Zoom, Facebook or YouTube, you can put it in the comments underneath. And if you want to say if you're a student or a parent or an educator, that would be helpful, because we would like to get a diverse set of views. You can say what school you're at, just in parentheses or something, just so we can try to manage that. Thank you.
Okay, so for our initial discussion here, we have a group of panelists, as Christy mentioned, and the idea was to gain some representation from across our school system. So Christy introduced them earlier, but let me just ask each panelist to just take 40 seconds. Just state your name and your role and how your interest in addressing climate change is related to that role. So I'm not going to go alphabetical. I'm going to go in order of the faces that I see on Zoom here. So Gary, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Gary Schiffman, Social Studies Curriculum Coordinator. I work with Roger all the time. So Brookline High School is to supervise the teachers and the curriculum in the social studies department. And, you know, before the pandemic, I was already convinced that climate change is the great threat to democracy and democratic governance, not just here, but across the world. And pandemic brought it home. I'm worried about our democracy, and I think Roger has identified the fundamental challenge that democracy and democratic institutions are going to face going forward. Getting a little flavor right now what crisis is like. And I think the fundamental mission of the high school, which is to prepare students to participate in a democratic society, the right way to frame that agenda in our time is through climate change.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne.
Yeah, hi, good evening. I'm Suzanne Fetterspiel. I am on the school committee. I have 2 adult children who went to Pierce and then BHS. As a family, we've been involved in sustainability for quite some time. You can come see our solar panels on the house. It's near the village. Yeah, so I will jump in as we need to kind of talk about the school committee's view and efforts in this whole area. And thank you so much, Roger, for doing this.
Thank you, Suzanne. Tanya.
Hi, Tanya Paris. I'm a kindergarten teacher at Pierce. I am very passionate about the environment and social justice issues. My husband and I run a nonprofit foundation, that's Margarita's Foundation in the Dominican Republic, where we work on communities and focusing on issues related to the environment and education. I'm happy to be here.
Great, and you'll be working with some of our youngest students on gardening with your new grant. Jeremy, I can't remember, are you going as a panelist as well? You're muted though. Yes. Jeremy, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, technology. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a teacher at the Coolidge Corner School, an 8th grade math teacher and also a Brookline resident. I guess I'm interested in also an activist and a leader in the Brookline Educators Union, a member of the executive board, not representing the union at all in that role. But I would say that I'm interested in both what I can figure out in my own classroom space, but also just generally how we can sort of create more space in the schools and in general to talk about what really matters and to have education and ideas focused on addressing the needs of all people and not seeing education as simply a place where we allow some people to get access to the diminishing number of reasonably compensated jobs that exist in society.
Okay, thank you. Anjali.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anjali. I am a senior at Brookline High School. I'm also a member of the Sunrise Movement, both locally and nationally, and a general coordinator for the Boston Climate Strike. I think as a student, I'm really interested in increasing student engagement in climate-related issues, including climate justice. And then as an activist, I'm more focused on getting young people a seat at the table in terms of decision-making and policy around environmental and climate-related legislation, as well as engaging in moral protest to push those policies forward.
Thank you. Aspen.
Hello, my name is Aspen Johnson Zagar, and I am a Tier 6 grader and a climate activist and many ways, but I co-host the Dot Report, which is an eco news show that is a local cable show and YouTube show. And I also helped found the Youth Climate Adaptation Challenge Science Fair. And I'm also an avid supporter of climate awareness education in schools. And I really want to work towards, because Brookline right now I feel such a progressive town, but I don't really see in our schools us educating our students on climate awareness and how to help the environment. And I really
Okay, Aspen, thank you. And if you have a chance to maybe pull your microphone a little bit closer, or it's just a little bit crackly. And Francesca. No, we got to unmute. Hold on, Francesca. Yeah, we got to unmute. There you go. Okay.
There I am. Hi, everybody. My name is Francesca Stark, and I am a 5th grade teacher at the Driscoll School. I'm a Brookline resident. I went through the Brookline schools myself. I have 2 sons that went through Brookline. And I was actually a student in Driscoll at the, maybe not the first Earth Day, but one of those first ones in front of the Booksmith many moons ago. And they made us do something. Like, it was a townwide school event. We made a cloud village or something. But anyway, the town made us do something. And that was in the 70s. And so I run an environmental club called the it's called the Keep Club. It stands for Kids Expect Environmental Protection. And what's interesting to me about it is that kids expect environmental protection. And I would loved what you said, Roger. It's like kids do, but why don't curriculum coordinators or the superintendent? It should be like superintendents expect environmental protection, right? Like, everybody should expect it. And so I started the Keep Club really to I taught environmental projects every year, and then my students would go on. And so I decided I should start a club so that kids would keep going with the projects we started. And I'll talk more about it later, but so far so good. I think we all need to keep moving forward, and gives us hope and power.
All right, thank you, Francesca. So we're going to use this time now for all of you to exchange with each other. You don't have to wait for my asking a question, and not everyone has to answer every one of those questions. Feel free to, speak to each other, to respond to each other. Have your finger ready to mute or unmute as needed. But let's start with this. What are some of the ways you'd like to transform the norms and culture of our schools to address sustainability? And you can either just unmute and start talking, or raise a hand if you want me to. Actually, I can't unmute you, but I can call your name. So what are some of the ways you'd like to transform the norms and culture of our schools to address sustainability? Aspen, why don't you unmute and go right ahead? We can't hear you. Not yet. Now, Aspen, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. Why don't you continue to play with the microphone if you can. Let's have someone else jump in. What are some of the ways you'd like to transform the culture of our schools? Anjali, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, so I think currently our school seems to focus solely on, let's stop using straws so that we can protect polar bears, without understanding both the urgency and the scope of the climate crisis. I think oftentimes people treat sustainability as something that is fun as opposed to something that is necessary. And I think kind of changing that culture and bridging what I call an urgency gap to realize the actual crisis that climate change is.
Who else would like to answer that question? Aspen, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Is that one?
Yep.
So I think that we need to make a climate awareness education program, and that is mandatory. It could educate students. That could honestly just change the culture and the mindset that people are already in.
I think we lost you again. Go ahead.
Okay. I really think the best way to cover it all is to just create a. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Could you lower your microphone a little bit? It might help.
Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. I think the best way to cover it all is to just come up with some sort of climate awareness education program that is mandatory for students. From that will help change the culture.
Okay. Mandatory climate awareness.
Yeah, I was just going to just jump in just to repeat in case the audio was difficult. What I heard was a climate education awareness program that would be mandatory for all students. It's such a good idea, and I want to make second the motion.
Jeremy, you teach elementary math. I mean, is there a place in all disciplines? Does math have a role to play?
Well, I certainly has a role to play. I think that math is a great example of the struggle between sort of covering content and also kind of things that are more maybe might consider topical or values based. I think maybe we should do all the math we're doing right now and then an additional double math and other stuff too. But that's just me as a math teacher. But I think it's very hard for us to get to find space for explicitly named values around the climate emergency, around climate literacy, around issues of social justice and social inequities. There is an idea that we somehow can sort of do business as usual in this situation and just squeeze little things around the edges that reflect sort of our values. And I think that it's an ideological enterprise at this point in history, it probably always has been, that we're engaged in, and we have to be explicit about our values and thinking about all the ways we can actually align with what we care about and know is important. And so math has to do that too, but it's not just math as a discrete piece. It's like we just have to really rethink what we're spending our time talking and thinking about in schools. And it's not just a reformist piece there. I think we have to think about it somewhat radically.
Just to interject, part of what I'm hearing you say is that you can embed the language of equity as both the language and examples around equity, for example, in math problem solving, and incorporate the language of the values that we want to achieve in the teaching of math as well.
Yeah, I mean, it can be better there, and it also comes up in project-based learning. Let me jump. I see some other hands up, yeah. So let me just go ahead.
Suzanne.
Yeah, well, I agree. And I agree with Aspen. I think there really probably should be some requirements around learning about the environment as a required course, and that it's a kind of its own unit. But I also think we need to think about integrating it and weaving it throughout the day and throughout the entire curriculum. So I think there is a place to learn the language and the thinking and the viewing of the environment and sustainability, but that also needs to be woven throughout the day. And that, as we talk about, Jeremy just mentioned project-based learning, that where you throw math in with your inquiry around the environment, and that should be all integrated.
Suzanne, can you just say just a teeny bit more, because from the perspective of the school committee, you're certainly looking at curriculum, but you're looking at everything else in the school system. So where can you maybe identify some other ways that as a system we can begin to transform those values, not just in the classroom, but elsewhere?
Well, I think, and Tanya could certainly speak to this in terms of what she does around curriculum, but curriculum can be, some set standards and some specific learning units, but it also can be, as Francesca will tell you, you go outside and you look around and you do the work and you look about the projects and you think about a project where you bring the math in or you bring the reading in. And I will say that it's come to our attention that, for instance, the minutes for science and social studies have been drastically reduced in the last year in K-5 classes. And I am absolutely opposed to that. I think it's outrageous. I think it should be the other way around. We should lead more with science and social studies and bring the reading and math into that as well. So, but then when they do extracurricular things around drama, they're doing the plays or they're doing the sports or whatever extracurricular, what we might call that, should also include just thinking about sustainable efforts and activities. It should be a lens and a hat that we're always wearing.
Mm-hmm. Francesca.
Just to repeat, but also add on. So because I've been teaching in the school system for so long, I feel sometimes like I will take curriculum. For example, we, in the fifth grade teachers teach birds, and we also teach energy. Now that's a perfect entrance way. And I can then teach sustainability and ecosystems and why are 3 billion birds gone and why don't we create a bird sanctuary? And I can interweave it, but that's partly because I have been teaching long enough that I feel like I have I've been here long enough that I'm going to say, I'm going to do this. But when new teachers come along, and if I go to other teachers and say, hey, why don't you do this or put this in? The teachers have so much curriculum. And I think they'll say, like, I'd love to do this, but it's extra. So what's happened is that the environment, I had to create a keep club because it had to be a club because it's not in the school day. It's become extra. And so teachers, especially new teachers, they can't say, oh, I'm just, I have to push this aside to put that in. It can't be extra. And an emergency, it's like flashlights can't be extra, like it's like that. It can't be extra. So it has to be woven in, and teachers have to be expected, not only expected, but asked to do it and then woven in. And even the people in this panel, all of us, and I'm sure I have a feeling everybody watching this would have lots of ideas of how to do this, and we just have to put our heads together and do it.
Tanya.
Yes, definitely. I agree with that. And I'm also thinking about time. To me, it's just a matter of time, right? I would love to see more time allow for teachers to make those decisions, like for me to take my students outside more, to engage with the outdoors, maintaining the gardens, watering, tasting what we grow. There is that very famous quote, if we want our children to take care of the earth, we first need to teach them to love it. And I feel like we are failing our students because of the focus is on the indoor, follow the schedule, follow this curriculum mandates. And so that makes me sad. But yes, I would like to have more flexibility as a teacher, more opportunity to do the curriculum integration. I think, our peers, Leslie is just incredible and supports these views and these core values. But like Roger said, I would love to see the central office make these things, take a stand, a real meaningful stand on this.
I want to just read a question we have, and if you have something else you want to say, just let me know and I'll stop. A question we have from Andy Liu, who's a parent and school committee candidate, who asks, what concrete steps, and this kind of follows what Aspen had to say, what concrete steps would be most effective in jumpstarting the creation of an interdisciplinary climate change curriculum? Gary, do you mind if I start with you? Just because you're kind of looking at curriculum from an admin perspective. what would it take to do that? I mean, we have a 2,000 person high school. It's a complex system.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's the right way to do it. I mean, we still, and will continue to have a responsibility to teach our students how to do math, science, social studies, English, all that stuff. And I don't think we can address problems like climate change without the skills. But this is a great opportunity to do what we always talk about, but in a very unfocused way, which is to sponsor and direct interdisciplinary learning. And so climate change, I mean, of course, this has to do with math. Of course, as you said very eloquently, and it has to do with science, and not only just doing science, but understanding when you read science, how to make sense of it, how to know how to be a skeptic in science, but not a cynic. Social studies, English, communication, all of it matters. I mean, Roger and I have had conversations about what it will take, the connection between our curriculum and the problem. Some of it has to do with basic politics that students are going to be better prepared to encounter if they know how their science affects their politics. So, for example, we're not going to solve climate change without global cooperation. So our students are going to need to know how the science about climate change works, but they're also going to have to know what the obstacles are to making robust international institutions, and which institutions in the past have worked and which ones haven't. There's no reason we can't have a laboratory in the high school that says, we're going to try to figure out how to simulate hard problems, and we're going to train your intelligence. Why can't senior year, for example, be a practicum in training your intelligence on a hard problem? It could be a piece of climate change, or it could be a simulation on the pandemic, where we say, think about science, think about politics, think about communication, think about how to represent the statistical world. There's your senior year. Tell us what you think we should do. And that prepares them for the ultimate step, which is to take responsibility for doing something about it. I love, and I want to say that I will take away the urgency gap phrase from Anjali. That's right. I mean, part of the way you feel the urgency is by practicing on it. So let's be interdisciplinary in the high school. In response to the question, let's be interdisciplinary by making our disciplines real and focusing them on a common problem. I see that as a perfect example of how to renovate senior year, for example.
Mm-hmm. Anyone from the, Francesca, go ahead. I think you're muted though. Oh, you're still muted.
Oh.
There you go.
You wanted me to say something?
Oh, I thought you were about to say something. Did you want to add anything?
I always am about to say something, but I wasn't actually going to say. Well, I think that come back to me, because I actually.
Okay. Maybe someone wants to say something, let me know, but Aspen, go ahead. You gotta just unmute. There you go.
To provide a student perspective, at least can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I guess this is the best I can do, but to provide a student perspective, I think that you should start, implementing like gently into the curricular, just different things that relate to climate change and different assignments and slideshows and presentations or guest speakers, classes or homework. And then as that further progresses, to start not moving into a whole new subject, but what Suzanne was earlier saying, to implement it in the subjects such as science and every one of those, science, math, writing, social studies.
And Anjali, if you want to add some more from the student perspective, I'll just mention that from the sustainability survey that I did at the high school, about half the students replied, and 50% of them said that they think that we should be teaching climate change all 4 years of high school. There were some that didn't want to learn about climate change all 4 years, but the fact that we're at 50% already without really doing it much, I think is significant. Anjali, I don't know if you have something you want to add, or maybe you could draw on, give us a little bit more from the student perspective. What do you hear students talking about? Are they concerned? Do they feel like they need more information? Do you think they would be excited about more of this interdisciplinary and project-based learning?
Yeah, I definitely know that the two subjects this year that I have learned the most about climate change have been biology and environmental science, because there seems to be this lack of understanding about the intersectionality of the climate crisis in terms of the fact that it is a social justice issue, it is an immigration issue, it's an economic issue. And I think, you know, we've looked at graphs about climate change, which could easily be implemented into mathematics. I've read things like articles and creative writing pieces that involve the climate crisis that could easily be integrated into a writing course. I think right now, every student at BHS has a baseline understanding of like carbon emissions, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand the full scope and implications of the climate crisis, as well as perhaps the effects that people are experiencing right now. Because oftentimes the stuff that is taught in courses at BHS is a little bit dehumanized in terms of hard facts, as opposed to understanding the impacts of certain events.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Francesca.
So I'm really happy that you said that, Anjali. And I was thinking about what Tanya was talking about. So one of my heroes is Rachel Carson. And, you know, she went and got her master's in all biology and everything. But a lot of the things that she discovered was because when she'd look into a tide pool and then notice that those little things were eating other things that she didn't know, and she realized there were ecosystems, and so she had time to look. And like the people who work for Mothers Out Front, like if you're studying trees and plants, you notice if the trees are dying, and if you're watching birds, you notice there are less birds. Like you have to know and care and love your environment. That's one piece. So we cannot teach our children to love the environment inside, right? Like that's crazy. So one thing is to actually get them to know. And then the other thing is that we have to, like what you were saying, Anjali, you can't just say, stop using straws. It's like, well, what the heck is wrong with a straw? It's this big. But the plastic industries, like economics, there's so much to understand between chemistry and what plastics are, and economically what is happening with the plastic industry and how they're going into now, because people are using fewer cars and airplanes, but they're producing a lot of plastics, and plastics are toxic. And so science teachers should be learning and could be teaching that. So I'm just saying that I think that every single element could be taught, but I also want to say that you have to start small, like what you were saying, Gary, like you have to have a project. You can't say to a kindergarten, first, or even fifth grader, like just stop climate change. Like what the heck is climate change? You have to start with one thing, and start where kids are at. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. I want to just remind people, if you have questions, to submit them on the Zoom chat, or I think it's either from Facebook or YouTube if you're watching the stream, and we'll keep checking for those. Let's talk just a little bit. Oh, Jeremy, please.
It's just two things. One, I think back to the question about what are students saying, or where are young people at? I think they're way ahead of the adults. My experience around their picture of what should be happening in schools and what they value, and what their understanding of what student engagement is about in education. So I think there's a lot we can learn from them. And the other thing, in terms of Andy's question about what we need, I mean, it's about all these little experiments and all the individual next steps, and all the teachers kind of trying things out, and every part counts. But we also need the leadership, where this is just where leaders in the school system are saying, like, this, I think about this every day, and I really care about this showing up in the schools that I'm leading in these different ways. And and that means like that we accept that we have thematic education, like it's both the modality of education, the pedagogy of project-based learning, but that it's oriented toward activism, toward social change, toward making a better world, and that we embrace that as part of our mission, and that we acknowledge that we are in a climate crisis and it's not business as usual. I just want to make one other quick point, which is that I keep thinking about what's going on right now with the COVID-19 economic crisis. There's this idea that somehow we're just going to make some adjustments and get this great economy back up and running again by getting people back to work. But it was already a broken economy. We're living we have a broken ecosystem, and we have a broken economy, and we have to be able to talk to each other about those realities.
So,
and our leaders need to be able to talk about that.
All right, and again, that's sort of the idea of bringing more authenticity into the classroom. But maybe I could just ask Tanya this to start. You know, I mean, you have a beautiful vision of how to engage young people around nature and to become naturalists as a foundational building block. But you also have a lot of other things you have to do and a lot of pressures as a classroom teacher. So if we're all saying we need to do this other new big thing right now, and it's interdisciplinary and project-based, you know, what does that mean from your advantage as a teacher to have to do more new stuff?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's doing more. I think for me is the go ahead, is the freedom, is the let my wings, right? Lose my wings so that I could do this work that is meaningful and powerful. The freedom to engage in meaningful experiences with the students, allowing them more time to be outside. You know, I worked in collaboration with parents on creating a pollinator garden, you know, the amazing Ben Kelly. And it was just a beautiful collaboration. But, you know, I had people, administrators that trusted that work and let us do that. We just got a beautiful grant, a BEF grant for 25 educators across the district, and many parents are part of that. And so, but this is the kind of things I think, maybe Francesca, you mentioned that because we have been around for so long, I think we had that little bit of trust of that would take risk a little bit, professional risk in that sense. So we jump in because we know that we had the support from our principals, or because they said, well, Tanya is too old now, leave her alone, let her do her thing. But I think there is there's a balance there. There is like me pushing for what I believe is right, but also being in a place where I have parent support, colleagues, and administrators too.
How about just on the flip side, what are some of the obstacles to Brookline schools becoming more sustainable in the classroom and beyond? Maybe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I will say the same thing. The obstacles is sort of like the opposite, right? Not having a central leadership that is making this taking the stand, right? Saying this is what the core we believe as a district, and these are the things that are important. And so getting those mandates from the central office, that beautiful vision, I think is a challenge, because it is the message that those things are not important or not important enough. So that for me is the biggest challenge right now.
I want to ask that same question to Gary and Suzanne, and maybe start with Gary. Gary, you're supervising, I think, 20-something teachers, and some of them are new and just trying to get their feet wet and so forth. And you know, you're someone who values teacher autonomy in the classroom. So we're saying this is incredibly important, but I don't want to tell you what to do. So how do we make that leap there?
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, it's interesting. The advantage older teachers have, like Roger can get away with all kinds of stuff like tonight because he's Roger Grande, has an award named after him, and rightly so. So if Roger says he wants to do something, my job is to support him. But I also think that younger teachers are inclined to collaborate and to cooperate, and they want to work on a team, and they're teachers for a reason. They believe in mission. And so I think what Tanya said is exactly right. A leader with a vision who said, I think we should all do this, would unite the veteran teachers with the confidence to do it and the younger teachers with the desire to do it, and we would do it. I think, you know, we're suffering a little bit in the country, we're suffering a lot in the country from rudderless and slightly reckless leadership. And we're suffering in the district from not enough bold vision and flat out leadership, simple leadership. So I think that would make a huge difference.
Okay. And Suzanne, again, I mean, you're dealing with so many complex issues, especially now, and I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic as well, but maybe forgetting the pandemic for a second, what are some of the obstacles to driving a core value of climate sustainability?
Well, I think that is one of our obstacles. We lose sight of what some of our core values are. So, we give, we meaning I think school committee and central office sometimes gives mixed messages. So we say, yes, do this, do this, do this. And then we say, but you have to do, X, Y, and Z first. And so, we've always prided ourselves on giving teachers autonomy in the classroom and doing what they know they need to do. Even given that we have standards from the state, we still know that teachers can go forward in many different ways and make sure those skills are taught. So one of the things to think about, I think, is that skills and standards, meaning kind of skills, what you need to know as a first grader or a fourth grader, can be taught in many ways in many content areas. So, you can use the environment to teach math and to teach reading and to teach writing and all of that. And so I think we need to make sure that we give teachers permission to do that. Not older teachers, veteran teachers, experienced teachers, know how to do that. They've, back in the day, you would just shut the door and do what you knew you had to do. But that's not really, what we want to do now. We want to be collaborative. But I think experienced teachers can be leaders and can include the newer teachers and show them kind of the way to do some of this. I mean, it's a little bit of, outside of that box that a new teacher doesn't want to venture too far because it's a little scary out there. But I think if people are leading them and holding their hand and saying we can do this, that would be a great winning combination.
Can I just follow up? I mean, I think I hear a little bit of pushing back against, a couple of decades of ed reform, which really kind of took skills out of context. And, like others tonight, you're calling for more interdisciplinary sort of work and embedding those skills in authentic content. But realistically, we as teachers, we need the time, right? We need the professional development. Gary's and others have spoken about, we want the call from leadership, but then we need some of the practical matters settled, which is paying for us to spend time together in the summer and elsewhere and doing trainings and designing the curriculum. The horizon has probably changed, especially in the last couple of months, but what are the prospects for that happening as well? Yeah,
well, so you're right. We need to give teachers time. I mean, I'm a big believer in having grade level meetings, or certainly you have department meetings, but we don't have that in the K-5 so much. And so I think that collaboration is really important. You're right. You're hearing from me some pushback and the ed reform stuff. I've always done that. Maybe not everybody on school committee agrees with me, but you invited me, so you get my view on that. But I believe very strongly in that. When I was a principal in Boston, I used to take my fifth graders, because I had a K-5. We went to a farm up in Vermont for a whole week every year. And it was just eye-opening for these very urban children to be on a farm. And, that's what I think was Tanya and Francesca both talked about, learning to love the environment and to know the environment so that you want to protect it. And so I do believe in that. And I do try to have that voice on school committee. So, keep me honest and say, I heard you say, what are you doing about it?
Mm-hmm. Again, if someone wants to jump in, please do. I'm just looking at a question from a student. Do you think this is going to be an easy change? And do you think students will actually do this? Will students actually be engaged in work around climate change in as many facets? What do people think? Is this going to be an easy change? Aspen, and just make sure you unmute.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. From a student's perspective, again, I think that this won't be an easy change, but I think it's a change that has to be made, whether it's easy or hard. We really have no choice. And
just pull the microphone just a little bit closer, Aspen. Sorry.
Okay. If this was a mandatory, if this was mandatory to learn about climate change student subjects, I feel like students would take a liking to it, or would say, this is going to affect my grades, so I should learn about that. And then it would eventually lead wow, this really does affect my life and on other people's lives, and we have less time than we thought, and I'm now educating it. And I feel like that can really shift the mindset of and kind of make it an easier adjustment.
So might be somewhat difficult, but one of the things I heard you say is letting students know the relevance of what we're learning to their lives personally and how important that is. I think that's a great. Go ahead.
I was just going to, I heard one thing at the beginning, Ashton. I think you said that whether it's easy or hard, we have to do it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I would maybe say it's going to be easy and it's going to be hard. Like in some ways, there's just so much pent up interest in kind of what we're talking about that in a way has been log jammed in Brookline for different reasons. And I think it's ready to could be accelerated based on just people's natural interest in, and it's going to be hard because I think that the more we push on these things, we know that there's reaction in our society around addressing issues of climate, and there's all kinds of confusions and pushback around anything that has to do with things that are sort of pegged as being, I used the word ideology earlier, but that's maybe misleading. But when you talk about education is a tool, and it has and it's values driven, even if it's not explicitly so. So as we reflect our values there will be conflict and difficult challenge, and so it's going to be hard too.
Mm-hmm. Francesca.
I think that it could be super easy if students really were taught this and allowed to speak. And I find that when, like, for example, with the Keep Club, if they go into, like, the Keep Club is 5th to 8th grade. So if the Keep Club members go into the K through 2nd, 3rd, 4th, it's not hard for the middle school kids to teach the younger kids why this is important. And then the younger kids teach their families. I think that part of this would be easier if the kids had more voice and were taught this, it would expand out. I think that you have the students lead the world, really. I mean, Anjali, like what you said you're doing, if we give voice to our students, it'll change a lot faster. They bring both hope and they bring immediacy, and it's their planet. So I think if we give them power and knowledge, they'll do it.
I want to follow with a question for Anjali, and then others can answer as well. And this is actually a couple questions from some folks from YouTube and elsewhere. This is from Naomi, who says, I'm a parent and wants to ask Anjali, how are Brookline students working with students in Boston and other areas of the state that are disproportionately impacted by climate change? What do you think our district leaders should be doing to work collaboratively with other districts on climate change? And my former colleague Lee says that climate change doesn't care about municipal boundaries. Lee's curious about connections across city lines, models to look at and adapt to Brookline, partnerships with other districts. Anjali, you work with students, across, I think, at least Eastern Massachusetts and nationally as well. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that first off, one thing that Brookline has to be aware of is its privilege in terms of its effect or the effects that climate change will have on the town itself, and how that will impact students. Because one reason that people or students don't necessarily notice in Brookline or pay attention to climate change is the fact that they don't see the impacts firsthand. If you go to somewhere like Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is experiencing a lot of environmental racism in terms of jet fuel from Logan Airport, road salt, and other industrial compounds. The idea that we need to understand that as much as we want to learn about climate change, we can't necessarily distance ourselves from the fact that in neighboring communities, these impacts are being felt at a disproportionate rate. I don't know if there's a way to communicate with districts specifically more impacted by climate change, but there's also just partnerships that could be created in terms of crossing both racial, economic, and geographical boundaries. That should happen. I mean, in terms of Boston Climate Strike and Sunrise Movement Boston, those are both organizations of young people that are from across Eastern Massachusetts. And in that way, I personally get to experience like connections with a lot of people that have very different experiences to me in a way that I get to understand my privilege in living in Brookline. And I think that's something that most students don't get to do.
Does anyone else want to respond to that as well about working across districts? I'm seeing just looking at a couple comments as well online here. Standards do not transform children. Great teachers transform children. And you mentioned, Anjali, just going back to your comment for a minute about Chelsea. Chelsea is is a low-income community, has a high Latino population. I think it's one of the epicenters of the pandemic for Massachusetts right now as well. So again, we've seen that sort of concentration, but it sounds to me like we have a lot to learn from Chelsea, given that they are more of a frontline community in Massachusetts when it comes to climate change. And I would share the questions sort of impulse of working outside of our district as well. I'm just trying to keep up with comments here. Right now, some students are lucky to have teachers address the climate crisis and inspire the right approach. Do we still need guidance for our teachers? Do we, what's the role of leadership? I'm hoping I'm understanding that comment correctly. Would anyone like to comment on that? Again, right now, some of our students are lucky to have teachers address the climate crisis to inspire the right approach. But do we still need guidance for our teachers if we have such active students? Go ahead, Jeremy. Or just yes.
A simple yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, it has to resonate, in the conversation, and it doesn't, consistently. I mean, it's not necessarily about people not even that they don't care, that they're not aware, but they're not rewarded, or there's not the space where they feel, and I'm talking about principals, for example, or curriculum coordinators, where that space is, they feel like there's a space that they're invited to try to run into as educational leaders. And it shows, and so we keep a lid on this sort of pent up interest and demand that we're all talking about today.
You're a busy guy, you're working hard in the classroom. What's the thing that you most need guidance on? What do you most want direct support on?
Well, I mean, I'll use an example just that I proposed bringing educators together in a professional learning group just to talk about how we incorporate topics related to sustainability. And I was told that was not consistent with the math and literacy goals for our school. So partly it's just simple. That's a simple example of like this idea that somehow there isn't this interdisciplinary potential, it has to be talked about and explicitly recognized and encouraged. So it's just the conversation about what else, that I care about this. I'm glad, I know you care about it. Let's talk together about what we can do, and let's explore what other people are doing who are maybe further along around experimenting in these areas. So it has to be explicit, and it's not that consistently.
So So more visits and communication again outside the district where people are a little bit ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne.
Well, and also, listening to teachers and hearing what they want in terms of opportunities to come together, professional learning communities, opportunities around professional development. I mean, the expertise is within the district, but we need to have time to share and be with each other on this. Just an example is that I believe, at least K to 5, maybe K to 8, that there's been virtually no science professional development in the last number of years. It all went to literacy, or almost all, maybe some math. But you know, we need to listen to what teachers want and what they have to share and give them opportunities to do that. And it shouldn't come from top down. It should come from the staff and from the teachers. And we should allow them to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. We are in a long process of hiring a new superintendent, and I'm looking at a question from a parent. How important is it, and I definitely would like to hear the students chime in, is it that to make sure that the new leader understands the importance to lead on climate and to integrate that into school operations and education? And maybe just even broader, do we want to include questions about climate change in any hiring? But let's start with superintendent. Thoughts on that from anybody? If you were in the room, Aspen, what would you ask?
I would just ask, and I know that not everybody has like rural backgrounds or that climate change, but like
Aspen, keep the microphone real close to you.
Okay, participating in anti-climate change events or eco-news events. But I would ask, first of all, what have you done to participate in, climate change events, or help the climate, or what do you?
We're losing a little bit there. What I heard you say so far, though, is you want to know do you have a track record essentially as a superintendent or school employee elsewhere? Do you want to add a little bit more?
What have you done to contribute?
What have you done to contribute so far?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Something you'd like to ask Anjali in the superintendent search, or that you want the search committee to be sure that they're thinking about?
Whether or not someone is willing to take bold action on climate change would be a great question, because I think ultimately people in higher positions or in positions of more power can act both as like change makers, but also as role models. So if there is somebody at the top who's willing to take bold climate action in regard to any part of the school system, that can then hopefully inspire others to do the same.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to add to that? I'm looking at a comment or a question as well from Zoom from a BHS English teacher, wondering if I have a list of literature that English teachers could incorporate into their courses. Not off the top of my head. I definitely see things. There may have been an email in the sea of emails at various points in the fall where I think I wrote a couple English teachers, and I can try to dig that up. So to that person or whomever else, email me privately and I'll see if I can find some stuff. Francesca, you have some?
Well, I was just going to say that's a sort of a perfect example. The fact that that's not right at everybody's fingertips, right? Like there should be this list, like Rachel Carson would come to mind, or lots of people who are writing right now. There's so much literature out there. There's a lot of information, all the stuff that Bill McKibben, I mean, I don't want to just go on, but there is a lot of great, both fiction, historical fiction, nonfiction, lots of literature, and that should be at everybody's fingertips, pre-K all the way up, right? Mm-hmm. Like from Frog and Toad all the way up, there should be information, and we should all know it. And there's like great, all the women who wore the hat, the dead bird on their head, like the Lost Man's River, which talks about, anyway, I know it because I did it, but that's the thing. I should be sharing, people should be sharing, you should know, we should all know, everybody should have this at their fingertips, you know?
Yeah. So some sort of clearinghouse within the district to share resources as part of professional development could include, it could include book lists.
And also with the superintendent, it's like this, you know, I want to know what does the superintendent know? What does the superintendent know about the fossil fuel industry? What does the superintendent know about where the money in our government goes, you know, to support what does the superintendent think about the Keystone Pipeline? What is the superintendent like? I want to know what the superintendent knows and is intending to do about it. And I want to know on a small scale to a large scale, like, will the superintendent make sure that every school has a water filtration system so we don't have stupid plastic bottles and boxed water and all that? Like, what is the superintendent planning on doing small scale all the way up,
Okay. We have about 7 minutes left, and I know Christy's going to say a couple of things in the closing. So I'll just again encourage people, if you have questions from out there on your various platforms, please do send them in. I'm just checking to see if there's anything that I have missed. Let's see. Let's go to one of the questions that you had gotten in advance here. What are some of the skills? So if we're thinking about K to 12, pre-K to 12, by the time students get to that end, I mentioned the idea of Graduate Green, this idea that, the years that you're in Brookline Public Schools, by the time you get to the end of it, given the challenges that students will be facing or people will be facing once they graduate, what are some of the specific skills that you would want someone to take with them? What should students know how to do to be leaders on climate change mitigation? And you want to take a stab at that? It's a tough question. Gary.
I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure exactly how to teach this, but I think it would be important. I think it is important to teach students how to talk to people in a way that persuades them that something that seems currently unimportant to them may in fact be very important to them. I think the art of rational persuasion. And we used to call it rhetoric, but that got a bad name. I mean, it's problem. The climate change is a little bit like the pandemic, except the pandemic is much easier, and we're finding out how hard that is. People are dying. We can see my internet is unstable. Every day we get a number of people who died from the pandemic, and still it's hard to persuade some people that this requires collective action and that we need to understand the role of science in our policymaking, and that we're revealing great fissures in our society, and we need to redress those if we're going to recover well from this problem. Now imagine a problem that is actually quite diffuse and very slow moving. The waters rise, the temperature changes, but it happens at a, pardon the expression, a glacial speed. Although in Earth time, it's happening very fast, but in human time, it's happening very slowly. So I think the skill that may be most crucial, our students are great at science. We have a lot of great science and math people, a lot of great history students, a lot of great students, but to be able to talk to people across a broad range of concerns, who work in different places, who live in different places, that something that's far away is actually much closer than you think, and that we need to work together on it. I would say that's almost like the crucial missing link for all of us, and I don't know how to teach it.
Yeah, especially as you like to talk about an increasingly polarized country and a polarized world, how to talk across boundaries. We have just a few minutes left. Would anyone else like to identify a skill, given some of the challenges that we'll be facing around migration, democracy, equity, science, and technology? Suzanne?
I mean, there are some essential skills that all graduates will need, and certainly will need in the future, but things like, what questions should we be asking? What is a good question? What's inquiry? How do we look at the data and come up with questions? How do we know whether the data is telling us what it says it's telling us? How do we then, as Gary said, how do we share that with people? How do we do persuasion? How do we write about it? I mean, those are all very basic skills that our graduates do have, but that they need. And then having that content be the environment or sustainability gives us some authenticity to learning those skills. But those are really important skills that I think we do a good job of teaching even from early on, but that are very important.
Part of what I tried to say as well in my remarks earlier was that, we are teaching a lot of things already, but we don't have the climate and sustainability frame. And so it's just shifting those skills into that frame. I think we probably have time for one more question. This one is from YouTube, and maybe it's an appropriate way to end, just bringing up the important role of counselors and clinicians, healing trauma and so forth. What role do people not inside the classroom, specifically counselors, play as we move forward here?
Anjali, why don't you go ahead? I see your hand up.
Well, I think that oftentimes climate anxiety is something that is not necessarily acknowledged by administration or teachers or even society in general. And I think understanding that there are kids who are legitimately terrified about the state of the world that they are inheriting is something that a counselor has a vital role in, especially in terms of making students take that desperation or that fear and turn it into concrete action.
Thank you. Jeremy.
I would just say that students and all people think better when they feel connected and safe, and so that without connection, we can't think flexibly. And then I would also add that the idea that we're learning skills, but the skill is to act. It's not only what you know, it's the skill to organize and the skill to act in concert with other people for a common purpose. And that can mean all kinds of things and all kinds of levels. But it's really the idea that you're an agent of working to lead something to happen differently and to experimenting with that in all kinds of different ways. Not just receive things that you know about and can say explain that you know them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Would anyone else like to add anything else? And then I'm going to turn things over to Christy. I know Christy's going to say thank you, but I also just want to really express my immense gratitude for everyone who joined tonight, for particularly at the very end there, just adding such a humane impulse to what we're doing here, particularly in a really trying and difficult time, and having the bandwidth to add this into our lives right now. I know for me is very personally meaningful to be able to share that with you all. So I just really want to say thank you and thank you for your time tonight. I'm going to hand things off to Christy for closing.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to all of you as panelists and to all the people that attended. I'm going to just remind everyone who we had here in case you're wondering and didn't capture the names ahead of time. But thank you to all of our panelists. And we're so happy to see a great turnout. I know we had some technical difficulties, so I apologize. But this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, is our second time doing a webinar. And if you did not capture all of it, first of all, the big this conversation will be recorded and housed on Big, and I will try to share it with my networks to make sure all the Green team members get access to it. But Roger has another great lecture coming up that Brookline Adult Education will be hosting. And of course, that did move online. It was going to be an in-person lecture, but that's on May 27th, and it'll be just Roger. But if you want to come attend, I'm sure there's going to be a Q&A portion as well if you want to kind of get more into the conversation and hear a little bit more about the work that he's been doing and working on at the high school. I want to thank Brookline Interactive and Tice, who is on the back end helping us get this out and live. As I mentioned, the panelists, Brookline High School Innovation Fund, who funded Roger's time this year to really do a deep dive. And I do hope that we can continue this work into the next year among this group with Roger and others. It's a very open group, so if anyone's willing to dive in head first, please reach out. The community members that attended and for submitting your great questions, and then also the CAB and school volunteers, in particular Ben Kelly, Rebecca Salguero, and Jeremy Block and Roger. We've been kind of a little team working on it, but there's been other people, including about 100 people that got involved last January, and we do hope to continue that work. So you can reach out, climateactionbrookline.com. Again, you can sign up for our newsletter there to get general updates about Brookline, or you can go to the Green Teams Brookline site to get a little more detailed information about what we're trying to do at Green Teams. It's under construction, so constructive feedback welcome. And then there's an email, greenteam.pierce@gmail.com, if you want to be added to our Green Team list. So thank you very much, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for sticking around.
All right, thank you.